You know, in our world, and particularly in our country, we love this concept of freedom, that we value freedom. And I am grateful that we are in a country where we can speak freely. I can preach here right now without fear of being arrested or being censored by the government. And that's not a freedom that some people have in this world. It's not a freedom that has been common throughout the history of the world, but we have freedom and we love freedom. But one of the things about freedom is we have to make sure we recognize where we actually get our freedom. Because there's the freedom of what we'd say in the church, it's called the freedom of the flesh. It's the freedom to do what I want, when I want, how I want. But there's also the freedom of the Spirit. And those are two distinctly different things. The freedom of the flesh is about me. It's about what I want, about my preferences. It's about my way. And in a lot of ways, our political freedom is the freedom of the flesh. Because as long as my actions do not hinder the rights of another individual, I am free to do what I want. Now, there are some limitations that we recognize that, but in general, that is a freedom of the flesh. And not that the political freedoms are bad, that's not my point, but to recognize this freedom of the Spirit is greater. And the freedom of the Spirit gives us freedom from sin, from death, from darkness. It gives us freedom from the things of this world. And not that we are condemning the world intrinsically, but to recognize the Spirit or the flesh. We can have freedom in both, but not at the same time. And what I mean by that, it's either about me or it's about Jesus. And last week, we talked about kind of our motivation, what drives us. And I came to the conclusion of, is our output inward or upward? Is it to Jesus or is it for myself? And we're coming along the same lines here. So last week was about our motivation. Today is about our effort. It's about how we are called to work hard for Jesus. And we have to make sure our motivation is because of Jesus. And so the effort we put forth is because of that motivation. But we have to make sure it's not freedom of the flesh, it's freedom of the Spirit. Now, the freedom of the Spirit does not mean that we get rid of rules and regulations. That would be lawlessness, which is not necessarily what this freedom of the Spirit is doing. It's basically saying we are no longer obligated to sin. It's essentially saying we are choosing Jesus over everything. But one of the sins that we have to keep in check is the sin of pride. Now, pride is really, really difficult to measure and to keep in check because it's just hard to tell, are you being prideful or not? You know, you can think of certain sins. You're either lying or you're not. You're either stealing or you're not, right? Those are pretty clear, cut and dry. And I couldn't find anything to verify this, but I came across an author who made the statement that statistically, it says that the more you hate pride, the more prideful you are. And while there are other areas and vices in life where we see that the more you are hard on something, the more susceptible you are to that thing, whatever it may be. Well, I didn't find any statistics to back that up, partially because pride is so hard to measure. But pride competes with others. It refuses to submit to others. It's competitive, and some say it's the root of all sin. But in general, pride can really keep us from God. But we're going to look at a few scriptures today about our efforts, about the work that we're called to do. And the first one is in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10. And it says, whatever you do, do well. For when you go to the grave, there will be no more work, no more planning, no more knowledge or wisdom. Now Ecclesiastes is, the context of what's happening here is success is not the intent here. It's excellence. Doing things with excellence versus being successful. Now, you want to be successful, but success isn't always a good measurement of the excellence that you put forth. Because sometimes you can work really, really hard, put forth a lot of effort, and still not be successful. You can still fail with that. But if you did it with excellence, that is what Ecclesiastes is calling us to do. It's calling to keep a high standard, That even if we mess up, it wasn't because we were lazy. It wasn't because we were unprepared. It just happens. Now this concept of the grave, when you go to the grave that Ecclesiastes mentioned, is this Hebrew word Sheol, which is a word some of you may be familiar with. Sheol it's not necessarily Hades or hell. It's a shadowy place of existence. And probably the most familiar story we have that talks about Sheol is the story of Jonah. When Jonah was swallowed by the great fish and it was taken down, he was taken down to Sheol. He was taken down to the depths. He was taken down to a shadowy place of existence. Now, Psalm 119, verse 8 says, if I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, or Sheol, you are there. And so it's not as though God cannot reach people in Sheol, but it's talking about the depths, a place of despair, a place that almost has no hope. Now we say almost because in Jonah's story, God was able to bring Jonah out of the depths, out of Sheol. But our life is limited. That's part of what Ecclesiastes is telling us, that we only have so much time that we can give. We have a finite amount of time, finite amount of energy, of resources, of abilities. But even so, even though we know that we only have so much that we can do, so much that we can offer, we have hope in the future because we believe that the future belongs to God. That we don't have hope in the future because we think things are going to work out or things are going to be okay or we're going to figure it out. We have hope because the future belongs to God. And so we're drawn to the future, not in a way that it tries to escape our present reality, but in a way that tries to have the future and present intersect. And by that I mean ushering in the kingdom of heaven, the reign of Jesus here and now. Ecclesiastes is an Old Testament book, so it didn't have the benefit of Jesus. And so we can talk about Jesus today, recognizing that the kingdom of God is here and Jesus inaugurated it. We are ushering it in, waiting for Jesus to come back in the fullness to establish the kingdom of heaven so we can begin to live in it now. And so as I'm thinking about this concept of excellence, of Ecclesiastes telling us that whatever we do well, there's this concept that I've heard from various sources, and it says, pursue passions, not balance. And that's always intrigued me in the sense of a lot of times we can use balance to cover up mediocrity. That, well, I'm just trying to live a balanced life. And while there's value in balance in some contexts, what the point is that if we pursue our passions, then we're going to live a more fulfilled life. We're going to live a more effective life. We're going to live a life that God has called us to live, because sometimes we can say, well, I've got to have balance in my life, so I just can't do this well. Well, if you can't do it well, are we actually following what Ecclesiastes say? Whatever you do well. Don't do something half-hearted. And so one of the hard things with pursuing passions over balance is we have to consciously make choices of what we can and cannot do. We're limited. You know, our time is limited. We can only give so much. And so we have to be careful of what we're actually pursuing and the passions that we are trying to fulfill. Because at the end of life, we're not going to be saying, you know, I did a lot of things okay. I'm not sure I've met anybody that says, you know, I was pretty good with just being average in everything. That we want to be excellent. We want to serve Jesus with excellence. Not as though we're confusing excellence and success, but to make sure we recognize that all of our human triumphs are temporary, but are we following Jesus with as much effort, with as much energy as we possibly can? Because we recognize life is not about what I can accomplish. The purpose of my life is not about how much money I can accumulate, how many accolades I can add to my collection. It's not about how many friends I can have. It's not about my position or the promotions, not about the stuff I have. That's not what the point of life is. But that's what the freedom of the flesh says we want to pursue. The freedom of the flesh says pursue as much as you can get for yourself. Well, freedom of the Spirit changes how we live. It frees us from the bondage of the things of this world that eventually will lead to death. And so that's why I say pursue passions, not balance. pursue Jesus with everything we have. Don't try to balance Jesus with things that we have and opportunities that we have. But as I think about our pursuit of Jesus and how we follow him, particularly when we try to follow him with excellence, it brings me to the concept of holiness. And how do we define holiness? And unfortunately, I think a lot of ways we define holiness as one of two things. Either it's what we subtract. We don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do this, we don't do that. So we're good. We're avoiding these things, so we're holy. Or it's we add this. Well, I tithe, I attend a Sunday school class, I go to this, I serve, I go to this. I do all these types of things, which in and of themselves, those two things aren't bad, but holiness is not just about subtraction. Holiness is not just about addition. And sometimes we allow those concepts to creep into our life. Because I would say holiness is about action. And when I say action, I'm not necessarily saying addition. Because addition, to me, a lot of times comes to this, well, we're trying to have a balanced life. We've got to do all these things. It's a juggling act. Action is about just pursuing Jesus in the world we live in. It's about the passion of following him, not about the things that we're adding into our life. And when we pursue Jesus, we're probably going to add a few things into our life. We're probably going to subtract a few things out of our life. But those are just things that happen with it. Those are natural consequences of following Jesus. Those are not the goals in and of themselves. Because we don't need anything in our life but Jesus. When we try to add things or take them away, we're trying to kind of manipulate our own salvation at times. See, we don't need things in our life but Jesus, but we need to be moved by Jesus. You can't follow Jesus and stay still. We got to follow him, we got to be moved by him, and we got to get closer to him. And so when we have this faith in Jesus, it keeps us steady. Now, steady doesn't mean we're always going to be up and to the right when we're talking about our financial goals. Steady means that, there'll be bumps along the road, but we're still going to be focused on Jesus. We trust that Jesus can get us through. But we're talking about our effort here, about the extraordinary effort that Jesus calls us to make. And I love what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 11. He says, don't be lazy, but work hard and serve the Lord. And then he adds this one word at the end of this, that at least in my translation, enthusiastically. Serve the Lord, not just serve the Lord enthusiastically. So last week, I think it was last week, I came up on stage after the worship team led us in the first song, and I yelped or screamed or something of that nature. And afterwards, I was asked by the worship team, those on stage, that if I'm going to do that, let them know. The reason is they have these in-ear monitors that when they're turned on to my microphone, it's a little bit more disturbing than when you guys are sitting out of the audience. And so now, I apologize, worship team. I'll make a public apology to that one. But I think we need a little bit more of that. Yeah, shout for joy, exactly. Pastor Vance, the pastor who was before me, had this phrase. I don't know how often he used it, but I just think it's wonderful. And he says, "Don't be a lemon-sucking Christian," and I just think that's great. And now enthusiastically doesn't mean that we're just happy. It can. But it means that we do it with a grateful heart. That we're not an Eeyore walking around, well, I'm serving Jesus today, right? But yet that's how we look. And I just, Apostle Paul could have stopped. He says, but work hard and serve the Lord. That's a complete sentence. He didn't have to add anything, but he said enthusiastically. Do it with vigor. Do it with excitement. Do it in a way that shows people that it's worth following. But you know what often accompanies laziness? Complaints. And maybe not always, but usually laziness or indifference maybe is a better word for that. But complaints have no benefit. Now, I recognize there can be a difference between sharing your opinion or even venting and complaining. But often, sharing our opinion becomes a complaint after about a sentence and a half. All right, I mean, let's make sure we call a spade, right? And so we have to be careful with this, that it's complaining can be really detrimental. And we aren't called to live that way. We're called to be people that love. Right? The word for the love in the New Testament is agape, unconquerable benevolence. You want the best for the other person. Now, we're talking about the context of the church, but man, those people that aren't Christians, that just drive you crazy, we're still supposed to display agape to them. Your boss that's just as mean to you, we're supposed to display agape to them. Your neighbor who's disrespectful, we're supposed to display agape to them. But one of the things I think that happens is we're trying to do so many things that we lack the energy to do most of them well. And so as we're talking about serving the Lord, working hard, whatever you do well, when we're talking about that, we need to make sure we align our passions with our work. Now, some of you have served, whether you're talking about in the church or a place in the community, whatever that is, and you've served that things you've just really, really enjoyed. And you've served in a way that was connected to your passion. And when you do so, it's energizing, it's fulfilling, it's exciting. You look forward to doing it. There are other instances where we've served just because they needed a warm body, and we did it. And first off, if you have or are doing that in the church, thank you for your service. You know, sometimes we just have to roll up our sleeves and do it. But I hope that's not our default mode. Because what's happening is when we serve outside of our passions, then that energy gets drained from our passions, and then we can't fulfill our passions and pursue our passions with the same level of excellence that we could otherwise. And so this is dangerous to talk about sometimes, because on some levels I'm saying, if it's not your passion, stop serving there and serve somewhere else. Because you're going to be happier when you serve in your passion. You're going to be more effective when you serve in your passion. And it's just going to be a better situation in general. But I do think we have to be careful that sometimes we are called to make sacrifices. I love, I forgot to look this up, wherever it is. I think it's in James. I consider it pure joy when I can suffer, right? In Acts, they talk about, the apostles talk about, they consider it joy that were considered worthy to suffer for the gospel. So I'm not saying just because you're suffering doesn't mean you're not where God wants you to be. Sometimes God puts us in places where we're called to suffer. We're called to pursue Him in that way. But our zeal, our enthusiasm, our passion for Jesus must be constant, but it also must be authentic. And if you're serving within your passion, it's going to be authentic. If you're serving outside your passion, it's going to be more difficult to keep up that enthusiasm and zeal for it. But again, I'm coming back to the concept of freedom of the flesh or freedom of the spirit. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Whether we're talking about serving in the church or in the community, or whether we're talking about the food you eat or the car you drive, just because you should doesn't mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But the freedom of the flesh says, well, it's my time. I can spend it how I want. It's my money. I can spend it how I want. It's mine. It's mine. I can do what I want. And from a worldly standpoint, followers of Jesus are called to fight against injustice. When injustice happens in this world, followers of Jesus can't just stand back and say, that's okay. And when we are indifferent to it or ignore it, a lot of times that is a sign that we approve of whatever that may be. And so we can't stand back and ignore injustices, but we also have to recognize that fighting for political freedoms is not the primary purpose of followers of Jesus. We can think of this world, our nation has been in existence for 250-ish years, right? Getting close to that. And we have freedoms, and we're blessed for that. But throughout history, and even now, a lot of people don't experience the same freedoms. But the church can continue to thrive. The church can continue to be a place of hope. Now, the church is called to make the world a better place. And sometimes that means making political laws or political decisions. But the Holy Spirit, the purpose of the freedom of the Spirit is not so that we can get political freedoms. It's so that we can be free from the bondage that the world tries to put on us. Sin, suffering, death, those types of things. The Holy Spirit can free us from legalism, from fear, from all of those things. So this is why we're putting forth our effort. And we need to make sure we put it towards the freedom of the Spirit, not the freedom of the flesh. But it takes effort. It takes work. And in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 24, it says, work hard and become a leader. Be lazy and become a slave. Now hard work is usually rewarded. If you see someone working hard, you usually appreciate that. If you're an employer, you recognize that and potentially promote that person. Now, there are some exceptions. I recognize that just because somebody works hard doesn't mean their work is good. It also doesn't mean that they will actually be rewarded accordingly. And there's the phrase that no good deed goes unpunished. I think that's a poor sentiment. And there may be examples where that's real and that exists. But we're talking about what Jesus is calling us to do. Jesus is not calling us to play by the rules of this world. He's calling us to a new life, to a different life. And often when we're lazy or when we don't put forth the proper effort, it often means that we are at the mercy of others. Somebody else to pick up the slack, somebody to give us grace, somebody to cover for our mistakes. Now, we don't all have the same ambition, nor do we all have the same passions. And so the point is not to make sure that we all look the same. I think I look pretty good, but whatever. But the point is our ambition can be different. Our passions can be different. And not everybody has the same level of ambition. But if you find your passion, your ambition is probably going to rise in that passion. And if we're pursuing the freedom of the Spirit, we're pursuing Jesus, that's going to change how we do it. It's going to change why we do it. And it's going to bring fulfillment to our life. But as I said, Jesus is calling us to a different life. And on many ways, and in many instances, Jesus contradicts the common thought of the world. Jesus challenges us, and he challenges culture. You read the Gospels, read the teachings, the messages that Jesus provides, and it's just crazy compared to what the world says we should do. If you don't believe me, read Matthew chapter 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And it's a powerful time where Jesus just lays out the countercultural life his followers are called to live. And in Matthew chapter 5, there's a few things specifically that he mentions. He talks about, if somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other one to them. If someone sues you, give them your tunic or your cloak as well. That's not how the world functions. But that's how Jesus calls his followers to function. Because we can't worry about these worldly losses when we're talking about kingdom gains. See, we can worry about our personal freedoms, the freedom of the flesh, or the freedom of the Spirit, but we can't do both at the same time. And so as I was thinking about how do we apply this to our lives today? And because we can't be forced to go a mile in the same way that Jesus did in his context in Matthew chapter 5. But if somebody insults you, why not say something kind about them? Wouldn't that be radical? Now, a lot of times, people don't insult you to your face, but somebody else tells you about it. Well, what if when that messenger has told you about this insult, what if you then say something nice about the person who originally insulted you to the messenger? Wouldn't that change the thought process a little bit? Wouldn't that change? And you know, what if when you go out to eat, if you have a terrible server, and what if you still tip them well? Because you know what? You're not going to change the world by getting revenge. You're not going to change the world by acting like the world. If someone insults you and you insult them back, that is playing by the rules of the world. If a server is poor and you don't tip them at all, that is playing by the rules of the world. And Jesus calls us to live differently. But you know what? It wasn't just lip service for Jesus. He lived that way. Because in Matthew chapter 8, he encounters a man with leprosy. And those who had leprosy in that time were essentially exiled from civilization. They had to live away from other people because people were scared that they would be able to catch the leprosy. And in fact, if you came in contact with someone with leprosy, you were considered ceremonial unclean, had to go through a quarantine process and a cleansing process before you could be reintroduced to society. But this man with leprosy came up to Jesus, which was a huge risk for the man in the first place. Now, he didn't have much worth risking, so it wasn't that big of a risk, but he was risking getting beaten, getting exiled, being condemned even further. And so the man came up to Jesus, and Jesus, the text tells us in Matthew chapter 8, after the interaction, he reached out and he touched the man with leprosy. And I love this concept because Jesus, he wasn't scared by the things in this world. He went after them head on. And instead of being repulsed by this man with leprosy, he reached out and he touched him. And the text tells us Jesus touched him and then he healed them. He touched him first. So it's not as though the man was healed and then Jesus said, let's have a hug it out or something like that. The man was healed after Jesus touched him, which shows that Jesus was willing to risk himself for it. But one of the things about Jesus is Jesus was not contaminated. Jesus lived in a world of sin, yet was without sin. And so he reached out, he touched the man with leprosy, and he was not contaminated himself. And he calls us as his followers to go out into this world of sin, to go out into this world that is contaminated, and be him to this world, to show people the love of Jesus, to show people that they can be healed, to show them that they can have a better life, that there's something better for them than the freedom of the flesh. And if we do that in the name of Jesus, we can go out into the world that is contaminated, but yet we won't be contaminated ourselves. Amen. Now, there's some additional principles with that of Jesus consistently spent time with the Father. Right? He did that refreshing. It's not as though Jesus was just skipping along life and doing whatever he wanted willy-nilly and not having anything to worry about. He was doing it in a way that honored God, and he stayed connected with the Father to receive the spiritual power that he needed to avoid the contamination of this world. And so what I'm getting at again is that we need to pursue our passions, not balance. We need to pursue Jesus with everything we have and recognize the gifts he's given us and put our efforts all that way for Jesus. Now, the last scripture I'm going to read is Proverbs chapter 13, verse 4. It says, lazy people want much but get little. Those who work hard will prosper. Now, everyone has dreams or goals, and I say that, I'd say most people do. I remember an interaction I had years ago with an individual. I can't remember if he was still in high school or had recently graduated high school. And I asked him, son, what do you dream about? What are your goals? And he just gave me this blank stare. And he was raised in a situation that essentially dreams weren't something that the family had. And it broke my heart to recognize that some people can be raised in an environment, they live in an environment where they don't have hope. They don't have dreams and goals. But I would say outside of extreme situations, most people have dreams, goals, hopes, things they want in life. And we need to make sure we work hard for those things. And some things we want more than others and require more or less effort. But we can think of the goals we set. If your goal is to save $1,000, in 6 months, and you only save $500, you still save $500. So just because we don't hit the goal that we've articulated doesn't mean that we failed. Remember, the issue is not that we do it, that we're successful, but that we do it with excellence. But a lot of times we say, well, we want to save $1,000, but we don't do anything, and then we end up being $500 poor. And we haven't saved the money that we were hoping to save in the first place. And so the call is that we need to be diligent with the work that God has given us. And goals in and of themselves aren't necessarily the divine mission that Jesus has given us, but we have to have something that we're trying to pursue. If we say, I'm just trying to pursue Jesus, what does that mean? If I'm giving my effort to Jesus, what does that mean? How do we do that? Now, we can come back to holiness and say, well, it's this legalistic set of rules. Well, I do this, and this, and this, and this. And when goals become that, then they become useless. And they become something that holds us back. See, as Proverbs says, those who are lazy want much but get little. That doesn't mean just because you work hard, you're going to get a lot of worldly benefits from it. When we talk about these concepts, we have to be careful that we don't revert back to the prosperity gospel. That if I do this, God's going to give me this, and that's going to be great. Serving Jesus is not about your return on investment. We need to be both diligent in the work that God has given us, and we also need to dream big dreams. We need to do both. If we don't have big dreams, we're not going to be excited about serving Jesus. Right? If we don't have a passion that we're pursuing for Jesus, it's not going to be exciting. But I think we, again, have this wrong definition of holiness. And maybe that's just me talking, maybe that's just my perception, but I think sometimes we've accepted the world's definition of holiness. And the world's definition of holiness makes it feel rigid or unrelenting. It makes it feel constricting. But on the other side of things, I think sometimes we've narrowed following Jesus down so much that we have gotten to a point where we're no longer offended by sin. Oh, it is what it is. Oh, we're just dealing with that. That's just a vice in my life. Or we ignore what we're doing. So holiness is not just about following this list of rules. It's about the freedom the Spirit can give us. And so this effort we're called to put forth is not limited to just trying harder. It's not limited to this legalistic set of rules that we have prescribed to. It's freedom from bondage. It's freedom from sin. It's freedom from death. A couple of weeks ago, I read a quote from C.S. Lewis that I didn't originally plan to share today, but I just was thinking it fits so well. And C.S. Lewis said, this is talking on behalf of from God, "The only help I will give you is help to become perfect. You may want something less, but I will give you nothing less." Jesus is not going to help you be imperfect. Now, we're still going to fumble. We're still going to fall. We're still not going to be absolutely perfect from a moral standpoint. We're going to have things that we still need to work on. You're never going to arrive spiritually. But God will give you help to live the perfect life that He is calling you to live. So we need to pursue Jesus. But before we can be cured from the imperfections that we have in our life, we have to want to be cured. We have to come to Jesus recognizing that we need help. See, the only fatal thing is not that we're going to fail. The fatal thing is that we settle for anything less than perfection. Now, you're not perfect. Nobody is. And I think a lot of times we settle for that. Well, I'm not perfect, but I'm doing my best. I'm not sure that's where Jesus wants us to stop that conversation. There's more to that conversation. I'm not perfect, but I'm doing my best. But Jesus can help me do better. Amen. And as I was thinking today, we're called to pursue our passions, not balance. what would that look like for us? How do we pursue our passions, not balance?